Hello, friends, and welcome to what I'm thinking is the first podcast of the actual school year. The summer was spent by you, I hope, doing some work on animal behavior and on ecology. And so since that is true, why is the first homework assignment, the first podcast that I'm going to have you watch, not about that? Well, in fact, it is about that. It is the concept that knits, in fact, not just animal behavior and ecology, but everything else in biology together. And that is the idea of natural selection. And so that is really where we need to start in biology. We'll only do a brief introduction here to just make sure you've got this idea in your head. We'll go into much more detail later on in the year. But natural selection are two words that you really need to get a grasp on right away. So let's talk about why am I starting here? Why is this so foundational to the course? Well, because it's foundational to biology. I'm going to try to say his name. Theodosius Dobzhansky, I think, was a very prominent biologist for a long time, and there was an article from which this line has been quoted many, many times in 1973, where he stated, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." That's why we have to start here, and not just because he said it, but all of biology operates with natural selection at its foundation. It explains just about everything ultimately in biology. So we need to start here and remember to use this lens to look at pretty much everything we learn about this year. It helps us answer questions. Biology for many, many years was such just descriptive science, just people describing characteristics of living things and with no real meaningful way to make sense of them. Evolution and natural selection is what allows us to make sense of what we see in terms of how life is on this planet. Now, before we jump onto natural selection and evolution, there is one other word that we need to know that is discussed always with those things, and that is the term adaptation. Adaptations are just characteristics. They just happen to be characteristics that allow an organism to be better suited for its environment rather than worse, allow it to survive better, more frequently than an organism that does not have that characteristic or that adaptation. And if that organism can survive, then it can pass on its genes, because it will survive and reproduce and pass on those traits, those characteristics to their offspring, and they will survive, and so on. So an adaptation is something that allows an organism to be better suited, to be better surviving, to leave more offspring in its environment. So, natural selection, then, is a process that sculpts species. It doesn't sculpt an individual. An individual is born with certain traits, and either it lives or it dies. But depending on whether it and its many brothers and sisters and so on live or die, determines how the whole species is going to look in, thousands of years from now or whatever. Who lives and dies and becomes more numerous kind of determines how that species will be. So natural selection sculpts species over time, and every characteristic of an organism must be thought of in terms of natural selection and what is the value of that characteristic. And I'm talking about the molecular level. If we look at these are blood cells, red blood cells, and they are essentially sacs of a chemical called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a molecule that your body makes because your genes tell it to make this molecule, and this molecule is designed to carry molecular oxygen out your body to be used where your body needs it. And obviously oxygen is very critical. So hemoglobin is extremely adaptive characteristic possessed by many, 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 many organisms on Earth. Now, we can, of course, go beyond, and when we're talking about natural selection and evolution, most of us go to this picture here when we think of things. We think of body structures, and we think of things that visibly, on the surface, make an organism well suited to its environment. This organism is uncannily reminiscent of a leaf, but it's not a leaf. It is a praying mantis-like organism, and you can see its head and its little legs, yet it is sculpted to blend in beautifully with its environment, either so that it will not be eaten by a predator, or so also it can kind of blend in and capture prey items. That was beneficial to that organism. Organisms that were more leaf-like survived better than those that were not as leaf-like, and the ones that weren't as leaf-like couldn't compete as well, died off. These guys kept passing these leaf-like traits onto their offspring, and so on, until this is what the species looks like now. Now, getting back to what you did this summer with animal behavior, even behavior is, if we look at it through the lens of natural selection and evolution, very extraordinary behaviors can be explained, how they could have arisen, why they're beneficial, why the organisms do them. So, just for fun, there's this awesome little clip that I would like to show you. Let's look at this clip of a behavior and see if we can, lots of complexity here, and see if we can talk about it a little bit. Just take a look.
Steph, look. Steph.
Yep. On your back. So all you have to do is come out and lay on your back behind the dolphin. Please take the fins off. They only 6 feet. Any questions? You come behind the dolphins up here.
Now, what you're seeing here is interaction between completely different species. Clearly, there is so much at play here. You've got, obviously, the dolphins and this cat, but you've got human beings as well. All of these highly intelligent. Is there adaptive significance to this? Well, it's curiosity. Is that adaptively significant? I mean, we could go on and think about the implications of this. I just thought it was really cool, and I wanted to share it with you. So, let me back out of this right now so we can get back. It's also important to remember that not every characteristic that an organism possesses is perfectly adaptive to its environment, or necessarily even adaptive at all. Some characteristics are not adaptive. For example, that characteristic. Those are blood cells, but as you can see, they don't look quite the same as the blood cells from the earlier photograph. These cells, inside these cells, the hemoglobin molecules made by this person are made incorrectly, and they are misshapen, and that causes the blood cells to be misshapen, which prevents them from flowing smoothly through the blood vessels and results in the very devastating disease called sickle cell anemia. It's a characteristic. It's not terribly adaptive, yet it persists. Why would that be if natural selection is making organisms that are better adapted to their environment? Natural selection can even explain things that appear to be maladaptive. So we've got a lot to dive into here, and just want you to be thinking about it. All right, finally, well, maybe not quite finally, but I do want to make sure you understand the difference between these two ideas, evolution and natural selection. What is the difference between them? Evolution is simply saying that life has changed over time, and We can know that by looking at the fossil record. If we dig in the rocks and go far enough down and back into the rocks, what we find is in older rocks on Earth, there are organisms that existed 65 million years ago or whenever this dinosaur existed that do not exist anymore. You go back even further, you find other kinds of organisms that existed that do not exist anymore. If you go back far enough, about 3.5-ish billion years or so, you find that only single-celled organisms existed, and there was this gradual movement from single-celled organisms to organisms of increasing complexity over many, many millions of years. Evolution says that life has changed over time, and the fossil record unequivocally shows us that that is so. So evolution is not really debatable. Evolution has occurred. Life has changed over time. The fossils show us this. Natural selection is not the same thing. It's related. Natural selection simply explains how this change could possibly have occurred. Many people in ancient times said, well, life has changed over time, but no one could really explain how that might be possible. It is this man, Charles Darwin, who did propose this idea of natural selection and said, this is how I think living things could have changed over time. Species changed over time by this method. Now, natural selection says, and I would love for you to please watch this link that I'm showing you here on the video. I'm packaging it. It's a YouTube video that I'll put right next to this video on my YouTube channel, and I'll also put it on our webpage. David Attenborough explains the idea of natural selection, but essentially an organism is born with traits that make it well suited for its environment. If its brother or cousin doesn't have those same traits, by whatever reason, didn't get the same mutation, whatever, then they're not going to survive quite as well. They're not going to leave as many offspring. This one will leave lots of offspring because it survives better, and it will pass on those traits to its offspring, who will in turn pass on their traits to their offspring, and so on. And eventually they will simply outcompete the ones that don't have those traits, and they will die off, and these will survive, and soon the species overall will have the appearance of the well-adapted organisms, and the lesser adapted ones just won't make it. That's what natural selection is saying. Now, natural selection depends on novel traits, new things arising in organisms, and then getting passed on. This was the one thing that really puzzled Charles Darwin. He couldn't understand how this worked, and it was very troubling to him that he could not figure out how traits could get passed on and so on. He couldn't know that. We can. We know about something that he had no way of knowing because the molecular knowledge just wasn't there. We know about DNA. Mutational changes arise in DNA. DNA is the molecule that determines our traits. If you get a change in the DNA, a mutation, a random change, that can change a physical trait that you have. When two organisms reproduce, their DNA combines and makes a unique combination, so that organisms have that arise from that are different from their parents, and if that difference makes them better suited, then they will survive, and so on. So DNA is the key to how natural selection works, and so we're going to learn more about all of these ideas this year, but for now, please place this as the glasses through which you're going to view everything we do this year. It makes it more understandable if we can understand that all of these characteristics, whether molecular or entire organisms, are shaped by this concept. All right, that will be it for today. I thank you very much, and I'll see you again soon.